Chief Information Security Officers are under increasing pressure to effectively report on the organization's ability to secure its data. A recent survey by Deloitte reported that many CISOs share the following problems: limited resources, inadequate strategy, a lack of trust from executives, and ineffective communication about the organization's security. As boards and executives expand the frequency and depth of interactions regarding cybersecurity, CISOs must be able to translate the value and effectiveness of upwards of 100 controls to people with little or no information security expertise. Hello, and welcome to this audio webcast titled Making the Business Case for Security Investment, brought to you by TrustMap and IDG. This is the second webcast in our three-part series on managing security as a business function. My name's Tom Schmidt, Digital Content Director for IDG Strategic Marketing Services, and I'll be your host for this webcast. Joining me again is Malcolm Harkins, Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cymatic and a member of the TrustMap Board of Directors. Welcome, Malcolm.
Thanks, Tom. Happy to be here and happy to share some of my perspectives on making a business case for security investment.
Excellent. Malcolm, we've got a really rich topic to tackle in this webcast, and it's obviously top of mind for every CISO: how to obtain the resources and funding that are necessary to provide suitable protection for the business. Why don't you dig right in?
Thanks, Tom. And as I mentioned in my first webinar on trust in the economics of insecurity, my background is in finance and economics. And in fact, when I first started out of graduate school at Intel, I was in procurement. I negotiated procurement contracts in the engineering computing space, and then I moved into IT finance. So for me, this is second nature because that's how I grew up. And hopefully what I can share with everybody will give them some lessons learned and get them to think about ways in which they can make a business case, frame a story, frame a dialogue, frame a discussion so that they can get better traction in their environment and again, move the needle where we need to in terms of controls. Now, I'm also a person who, again, as you saw from the last webinar, likes quotes. Glynis Breckwell, who's a professor of psychology of risk in the UK, when I was writing my first book on managing risk and information security, I spent some time with her because I was thinking about, again, the sociological and psychological aspects of risk. And in her book on the psychology of risk, she has a quote in there: risk surrounds and envelops us. Without understanding it, we risk everything, and without capitalizing on it, we gain nothing. And I think it's very telling because in many cases as risk professionals, we seek to understand it, but we don't think about sometimes how to capitalize on it. And everything involves risk. Every business is making risky decisions all the time, which is why sometimes I see the security teams getting frustrated with people's desire to just accept risk. And some of it just because of the business side of it, it's what business leaders are doing every day when it comes to, do I invest in this or not? Do I open a new plant or not? Do I change the product lines? Do I enter into new markets? All those are risky corporate decisions, but they're financial ones that impact the business. Same thing is true on the cybersecurity side. We've just got to, again, organize our thoughts in terms of risk acceptance is fine. And sometimes it's a risk acceptance not in that we're going to leave a deficient control, but in many times what I've told people is sometimes we need to run to the risky things in order to shape the path of the risk. And so the early movers towards the riskiest technology in my mind should be the security team. You know, I go back to my time at Intel and when virtualization, even cloud, there's all this fear on it. And you go, why isn't the security team the first to virtualize? Why isn't the security team the first moving to the cloud? Why isn't the security team first to use artificial intelligence? If we're the early adopters of the riskiest things, guess what? We're going to be able to better manage and mitigate the risk before the rest of the business wants to do, quote unquote, these risky things. That'll, again, change the paradigm, change the mindset, change the business case we're making in our organizations and some of the dialogues that we need to have. I mentioned also in the last webinar this notion of being a choice architect. And, for a choice architect and to become one, you've got to think about three things. Again, framing the problem and opportunity. We talked about framing a little bit in the last dialogue. Again, what's the fiduciary risk, right? What's the customer risk? And perhaps what's the societal risk? And I've always had to frame risk that way because I was at Intel at the foundation of computing. So I had to think of risk to the business, risk to the customers, and societal risk. Again, think of risk to the business in the Pinto example, right? The liability, the cost of, and the delay of manufacturing a car. Risk to the customer, you ship a product that could harm them, and therefore they have exposure. And then societal risk. And in the computing sense, there's a variety of folks that are in those foundational elements that if they ship products, in an Intel example, you have a vulnerability. Yeah, the impact might be to a Dell and IBM or somebody who's buying a processor or board or memory. The other aspect of the risk is to the end user of computing. And the societal risk could be what happens if that computing platform collapses en masse. So again, we have to think about those things. In framing of the problem, in this case, with a different example from a dialogue I had with Pierre several years ago when I was talking about how to have these dialogues, was they were in the food and beverage industry, and they were struggling to get resonance on the risk dialogue with their executives. And I said, well, how are you having this dialogue with them? And they were like, well, they just don't care. And I'm like, well, that's probably a problem in how you're communicating it, not them and their lack of concern. And I said, let's pause on the typical risk issues. What is the number one business risk your business faces? And they were like, well, is the lettuce tainted with E. coli or is the hamburger meat gone bad? And I said, okay, so it's food safety. And it's like, yeah. I said, okay, great. So what's your problem then having a dialogue on cyber risk? And they didn't see the correlation between food safety and cyber risk. And I explained to them that if there's vulnerabilities in the data from the slaughterhouse into the truck that is carrying the side of beef that has an industrial control unit with a GPS and an RFID tag and all that, and then into the store, I said, how do you know your food is safe in mass other than the flow of data from the slaughterhouse all the way through the point of sale? And if I could manipulate that data and cause an integrity issue with it or cause an availability issue, I could kill your customers. And I said, so what's your cybersecurity program for your food safety data along that, in essence, supply chain of information? They looked at me kind of stunned, and I said, what, you don't have one? You don't know? You've been talking to them about payment card industry standard compliance? I was like, no wonder why they don't give a crap. It's like compliance is the residue of good security and privacy and good risk management. And you've got to have a dialogue on what the relevant risk is for the business and tie the cybersecurity stuff to it. So again, framing of that problem, and again, on the opportunity side, if the security team is the one moving and being the early adopter of the riskiest things, you're going to be able to, again, kind of frame an opportunity set for the organization for business velocity and innovation. Focus on outcomes. We talked about that last time too. What are the bottom line results you're going to get? What are the metrics and measurements you're going to use to demonstrate you achieved them? Not only on the risk scale, but on the cost scale. And then the aspects of facilitation. How do you have the right dialogue? Again, being a choice architect, in many ways, it goes beyond just contemplating risk or calculating risk. Part of our job is to pose the high contrast questions to ensure the right debate and dialogue occurs. Take the devil advocate's view. Get people to willfully suspend a notion of disbelief in something for just a moment so that you can, again, cause people to pause and think. And if you can cause them to pause and think, I think we'll have a better business outcome, a better dialogue, and better results with what we're doing. And this brings me to what the most significant vulnerability we face today and in the future is. I've thought about this a lot. I posed this question myself 14, 15 years ago, 3 or 4 years into my stint at Intel running security, because I'm in a tech company with a lot of great business leaders and a lot of great technical acumen. And yet, again, despite the fact peers in food and beverage industry and other ones said I had it easy because I was in the tech industry, and yet made some technical dialogues a little bit easier, but I still, by and large, have the same problems. And what I came to the conclusion was the biggest vulnerability we face today and in the future is the misperception of risk. Yet we all misperceive it. The security team does. The end users do, as we know, and decision makers do. And so we have to think about, again, from these dialogues of facilitation and framing and business outcomes, how we mitigate this misperception. But to mitigate it, you have to understand what causes then this misperception of risk. What drives all of us as individuals, as business leaders, as technologists to misperceive risk? Well, fundamentally, two things: economics and psychology. We talked about economics the last time, bringing in a little bit more psychological aspects to it today. On the economic front, again, it's the pressure of my quarter, the pressure of the revenue I'm trying to hit, the pressure of the net income. You go back to the first webinar that we did, and I talked about my no hard drives leaves Intel and the control failure that we had with the degaussing equipment. That was purely an economic thing. Didn't know what else to do with it. So guess what? I just shut off all the distribution of used computing equipment till we could figure it out. Took a while, well over a year, but that economics drove that. And again, the psychology of it. It's an interesting psychological thing. The more people perceive a value in something, they psychologically discount the risk. I learned that from talking to Glynis Breckwell when I was working on my first book, but I also learned it from my wife, who did her PhD in developmental psychology and emotion and behavior research in early childhood. The more people perceive a benefit in something, they psychologically reduce the risk. And so if you've got a business leader who's wanting to go do something and they see all the opportunity of it, psychologically they're going to discount the risk. Just like on the security team has this psychological phenomenon that I call target fixation. And target fixation came out of World War I when the fighter planes in Europe were doing strafing runs down at troops on the ground and areas that they were trying to disrupt or blow up. And what would happen is the plane would dive towards the earth and start shooting and bombing. They would sometimes forget a couple things. One, how fast they were going, how close they were getting to the ground, because they were focused on the target that they were fixated on, and forget to pull up in time and crash. Or they'd be so fixated on the one target they would lose sight of the fact there might be another plane above them shooting at them. And security teams do this too, and audit teams and compliance teams. We get target fixated on one thing. And that one thing might not actually be the most significant risk. The payment card industry standard compliant issue versus the people could die because don't have the right controls in place to maintain the integrity and availability of food safety data. And again, that target fixation can cause us to sometimes create more risk or focus on the wrong risk. So we all suffer from these things. Now, again, getting back to economics and psychology brought together, you can see this quote here: many CISOs have long expressed concern over their inability to attain resources and funding to support security investments that are necessary for a suitable level of protection. This came out of an abstract for a conference that a peer had written for an industry event that I saw, and I've used it for years. Inability to obtain resources and funding, economics, deemed necessary. Well, who deemed it necessary, and what were their perspectives around that? And is that, again, a psychological issue on risk between the security team, a compliance team, a business leader, and all summed up here in this item. Now, this individual, I counseled them afterwards when I saw the submission, because they were basically stating that either they didn't have the ability to get the resources or their executives didn't make the right risk decision, and they were doing it in writing and they were going to talk about it. I said, you know what? Just by writing this, you created a different risk issue. And they were like, what? I said, a discovery risk. I said, because you're the security expert. I said, now you just put in writing that you're unable to get funding, and basically your executives don't know what they're doing in terms of these risk decisions. I said, do you want that to be uncovered in a court of law later, and do you really believe that? And when I framed it that way, they're like, well, no, I don't really believe that. And I said, so what were you doing, just whining about it? And they were like, basically. And I said, well, great. put on your big boy pants and go do your job. Be a business leader and figure out how to go get the right resources. And he kept talking about the resource limitations he had. And I said, your company is 20, 30,000 people. It's like there's plenty of budget everywhere. You just got to go figure out how to get it by understanding, again, what I shared the last time, that control friction thing. If I can improve business velocity of the sales and marketing team, guess what? They might actually give me money to go do that. So I don't have to necessarily stay in the constraints of my security budget or the constraints of the IT budget. Again, being a former finance guy and procurement guy, I go, everybody's budget's my budget. Now I just need to figure out how to optimize them to optimize my approach to security and controls. How do I optimize my controls to improve their business? As soon as you change that dynamic, you get out of this whiny type world and, again, focus on business outcomes and business results. Now, risk assessment model, we're all by and large familiar with it. Risk is a function of three things: threat, vulnerability, consequence. But again, we always get gummed up in these questions, but what can you control and what the risk is, and the risk to who? And in this formula of threat, vulnerability, consequence, again, going back to what I talked about a little bit in the last webinar, how much is the industry focused on the threat actors and threat agents? Russia did this, China did that, this group did this group did that. Every time there's a breach, the press releases, an advanced actor, blah, 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 blah. Well, okay, yeah, that's great, but you know what? Let's get back to reality. My job as a chief security officer, what can I manage? I have little to no ability to control the threat actor and threat agent. I might have some ability to affect an insider risk, right? Particularly if we've got a crappy work environment and we don't have the right management philosophies and stuff like that. But all the external threat actors and threat agents, by and large, chief security officer can't control. It's useful to understand their motivations. It's useful to understand what they might want to do, but it's an uncontrollable variable. Consequence or impact is what it is based upon, the dependence you have on the technology or the data or the system. And so the only thing that's controllable in this equation is how vulnerable I am. And where do we spend, in many cases, a lot of time? We talk about all the threat actors and threat agents, which is what? A distraction from what we're accountable to. The attribution discussion. Again, did China did this? Did Russia did that? So that's talking about attribution to threat actor and threat agent, which, yeah, let nation states do it. Let law enforcement do it. We sometimes have to contribute to it and understand it. But it's a distraction to what we can do with 100% accuracy. Let's do attribution to the control that failed. Why did it fail? And how do we get better at that? Again, this brings us back to the challenge we have. There's two battlefields that we're fighting. And it's interesting when people start really thinking about it in terms of two battlefields versus one. The one battlefield that is the one that we see every day on the news, we talk about, it's what our job is day in and day out is dealing with those external factors, the threat actors and threat agents, right? The cyber actors, the growing attack surface. And the consequence and impact is growing, as we talked about, across users, business, and society. That's the battlefield that we have to manage through focusing on where we're vulnerable and how to make control improvements in a measured and disciplined fashion, how to have the metrics so that we can see where we're not doing good enough and make not only incremental change, but again, getting to that creativity. How do we create transformational change in those metrics and measurements and mature ourselves into a better spot? But the other battlefield is the internal battlefield. It's an internal battlefield of budgets, bureaucracies, and behaviors. We get slowed and distracted by this. And the consequence and impact of this battlefield is actually on you and your team. It affects the stamina to keep going. It creates those whiny statements that just says, hey, I'm unable to get what I need. I have this view that losers quit when they're tired, winners quit when they've won. Don't give up on this internal battlefield. Figure out how to play this game better. Now, again, go back into my history. Late 2001, after 9/11, Code Red and NIMDA, Andy Groves running Intel, frankly beating the crap out of the corporate officers to deal with the risk issues post 9/11 physically and logically post Code Red and NIMDA. when Doug Bush, who was Intel CIO at the time, asked me to run security and business continuity, I was like, Doug, I don't know crap about security. You need AV, firewall, and a few other things. He's like, I don't care that you know that, but I got a bunch of security folks who don't know crap about the business. You'll teach them and they'll teach you. And what I realized years later was he saw those two battlefields, and he knew that the technologists that were smart from a security perspective knew what they needed to do technically, but he needed somebody who knew how to win on the internal battlefield of budgets, bureaucracies, and behaviors, how to communicate, how to coordinate, how to program manage things, how to put together a real budget, how to put together business outcomes that I was going to be accountable for, as well as change not only the behaviors of the security team from that, again, office of no that we all talked about to what has become kind of my trademark statement of protect to enable. Because if the security team doesn't have a behavior mindset of protecting to enable the people, the data, and the business, you're not going to be able to have these dialogues. You're not going to be in the right frame of mind. And again, you're going to exacerbate those misperceptions of risk because you're going to be stuck on one point, somebody's going to be stuck on another. And then you're going to, again, add more bureaucracy and stuff. And then this also brings us to the budget side of it. How do we solve that? We'll go through that in a little bit more depth as well as we go into this. But what does it take to win on both fronts? What knowledge do we need to have? Again, a framework that I created for my book on managing risk and information security came out of this notion that there was a design company, IDEO, that many might be familiar with, been around for a long time, and they used to talk about a T-shaped individual. And the perfect technologist was T-shaped. They had a breadth of business acumen, and they had a depth of technical acumen, and they were the right, well, I'd say, shape from a skill set to manage technology. And when I think back to when I fell into this space and growing up in the tech industry and stuff like that, and when I was working on my book, I'm like, T-shaped is good, but chief security officers, chief information security officers, heck, even chief privacy officers, we need to be Z-shaped. We have to have this breadth of business acumen. That's our value to the business. That's how we communicate, we coordinate, we understand their mission and objective, and we create alignment to it. We have to have a breadth of technical acumen. That's our value to IT, our ability to communicate and coordinate with other technologists, whether in the IT organization or in the chief technology officer office or in the product development, because every company is becoming a tech company, right? Even brick and mortar companies are becoming tech companies. Heck, I had a dialogue not that long ago with a cement company, a true mortar company that was putting sensors into cement to sell big data and analytics back to municipalities to figure out when roads would deteriorate and eventually mash that data up with stuff in cars and your wearable devices and stuff like that for, again, just traffic efficiency and traffic flow. And again, a true mortar company becoming a technology company. And so you have to connect the business and the technology. And then our job is to, that depth, instead of a T, the hash here in the Z is our risk and security depth, our compliance acumen. That's how we communicate and coordinate and dial in the proper controls, getting back to what I talked about before. How do we think about the controls and its impact on technology, its impact on the business, in addition to its impact on risk? So we've got to grow ourselves in this multidimensional area of grow our technical acumen, grow our business acumen, continue to grow and stretch our risk and security and controls acumen. But we also have to be anchored with values. Again, getting back to trust as a function of two things, competence and character. Again, what results are we delivering based upon being Z-shaped? And the values are, again, what's our intent? What's our integrity? Are we being honorable? Are we being accountable? Are we being courageous? There's some times where we're going to have to say, hell no, not happening on my watch, and hold that line. And if we've built up enough credibility, if we've illustrated the right business case and the right, even if it's the risk to the company and organization itself is bearable, does it create an unbearable societal risk? Make sure those dialogues happen. Again, refresher on my 9 box of controls. I think, and what I've always tried to do when I've gone in to make a business case is really talk about how does the risk change? How does total cost of control change? And total cost of control change is not my budget. Total cost, again, is what are all these things, and we'll talk about what makes up total cost as we get a little bit further here. And then control friction. What are we doing to the business to either impede them or aid them? So getting back to, again, the primary value drivers for control investment, I've already mentioned some of these things, but it's worth repeating. Again, risk. What's the risk to the business? What's the risk to the customer? What's perhaps the societal risk? Frame out those 3 things. Cost. Again, cost to the company. Cost to your department or IT. Cash versus cost. Again, what you spend and what you write on a purchase order and how it shows up on your departmental expenses might be different, because there's capital expenditures, which get depreciated over sometimes a couple-year period, and then there's pure cash costs that, again, what's going out the door today. And if you don't understand these things, go get with a finance person. Go take an accounting class. Again, grow that business acumen, because you'll be better able to communicate all these things in your business versus just look to your finance person and ask them to answer. And again, that control friction, are you adding to it? If you are, you're increasing risk and increasing cost just in a different way of the business. If you're reducing it, you're improving business velocity. It might be reducing other costs, in which case you could go to a different department, a different organization, and said, I'm going to improve your business velocity by changing these controls. Would you like to invest in my solution and approach to make your business better? Think about that as a dialogue. I bet head of sales and marketing would love to have a security person come and talk to them that way. Again, it gets back to changing the conversation. But the other thing, as I talked about before, we continue to always ask for more and more and more and more and more. When do we go in to an investment review and an operational review with our senior management, or even our team, and holding our team accountable to do this as well? Where are you disinvesting? Where are we doing the weeding and feeding? Where are the controls that are not effective and not efficient? And start disinvesting in them, and show that we're constantly transforming what we're doing and how we're doing it. And at the end of the day, make a business result. Be accountable for an outcome. Beyond just saying, well, they're always going to get in, but I need more to manage the risk. And I've seen too many things like that. Or the measurements and metrics are too squishy. So you can always kind of be like Teflon and deflect any real accountability from it and say, well, the user did this and this business did that, and they went around the control. If somebody went around the control, aren't you accountable for putting a control in place that perhaps impeded their mission and their business objective? If you are, then be accountable for that, and then hold them accountable for doing something that perhaps they shouldn't. But we also need to be equally accountable when a user or a business, in essence, does something that generates a risk, because it says that we put in place the wrong control environment. We didn't properly manage the vulnerability. Now, this notion of, is a control effective or ineffective, there's a series of questions you can ask and really kind of get to some scoring around control effectiveness. Does it prevent the risk? If it prevents it, it's a better control. If it prevents it with a high degree of accuracy. Is it manual? Again, getting to the cost and repeatability of it. Is it understandable? Is it something that a user needs to know? And if it's something they need to know, or we're just shoving it in front of a computer and giving a manual training and calling that done, well, that's no way to build a behavior, right? Is it scoped appropriately? Is it measurable? Is it repeatable? That measurement and the repeatability of it will give us the metrics so that we can really see how well we're doing, how well the vendors are doing for us, and how well our business partners are doing on their ability to affect risk and manage the controls. Because we instrument them, we're responsible for a lot of them, but by and large, it's a diffused accountability. And so again, we have to have the visibility to how we're doing. I think if you do these type of design reviews for control, you can, again, come up to a simple view. Is the control design score strong? Is it properly mitigating the risk? Or is it insufficient, which means it's not designed to mitigate the risk sufficiently, it's only partially does it? Or is it flawed? It's not designed properly to mitigate the risk at all. Again, in the last webinar, I talked about the Equifax breach, and I'll encourage you to, again, to go download that House Oversight report, and you'll see control after control after control, insufficient and flawed controls. And then a report from a vendor that says do more of them. That's no path to really fundamentally changing what we're doing. If you got a flawed or insufficient control, there's two basic choices: redesign it so that it's strong, or remove it. If it's flawed, stop wasting money and giving yourself and everybody else a false sense of control. And I don't care if it's in a compliance checklist. Go argue with the auditor and say, that control is ineffective and it's wasting money. We're going to stop doing it. And then go force that dialogue, force that discussion. And total cost. Now, total cost it's an economic measure. It basically is the sum of all expenses. It's not only the initial cash outlay for something, but includes all the direct and indirect cost. And again, I'll give you some bucket breakdowns to make it a little bit clearer. But it's fixed cost, variable, overhead expenses. And again, it's a fundamental concept that most business owners or executives would get. I mean, certainly they're going to want to hold us accountable to our budget, and we need to be accountable for that, but we also need to, again, frame that total cost portrait, because that will then frame a bigger budget that we have to play with. If the head of IT operations is getting 5,000 calls a month at $20 a call for an issue because of the security control, and you can improve the control and reduce their cost, well, then you should go grab the money from their budget to then go invest in a better control. So again, think about how that money spreads around and where you can go grab money from, particularly if your budget is small and you need to be able to magnify it. There's some obvious direct cash buckets. Control replacement. I want tool A versus tool B, C, D, and E that are currently in place in the operations, and here's why. It's going to reduce the risk. Maybe the cost is flat, right? It might improve the user experience, right? You can look at your security operations cost. How much of that is reactive? How much of that is manual or semi-automated capabilities? How much are you spending on the hunting teams, investigations? Legal. In my total cost, I would include the cost of my lawyers, because guess what? If I needed more lawyers, internal or external, to deal with things because we didn't have a good control environment, you know how much lawyers cost? It's a lot of money, hundreds of dollars an hour. And when it's on the external side, it's even more. Help desk calls, as I already mentioned. Performance complaints. How many performance complaints are coming into the help desk because of security controls? Again, if you change the control and can reduce those complaints, you've just freed up budget. It's not in your budget, but it's money you should be able to go make a business case to use. There's other IT operations costs, whether it be emergency response, infrastructure. Again, network costs are big expenditures for a lot of companies. And think of all the data that's just being chewed up back and forth with the chattiness that a lot of security solutions have to servers or other portions of cloud environments. Well, if those can be more efficient and effective, can you reduce networking expenditures? And then obviously there's the cost of a breach, and we can all anchor off of what it's cost Equifax or Target or others, and can again frame those cost items. Some less obvious direct cash buckets, you declutter other controls, right? What am I going to reduce, right? Getting back to control replacement, or maybe just alter a different control. Loosen one control to strengthen another. And again, that might not only play with the user experience and that control friction, but that also might play with cost in different parts of the environment. Extending PC and server lifecycle. If you can have a more efficient control on a compute device, well, maybe you can extend the life of the system by 6 months a year. That's a capital cost savings for your infrastructure manager, which then reduces their capital needs, which then can be, again, reinvested in other things. You could change patching windows. A lot of people I've had this dialogue. We have to patch, and I completely agree with patching. But let's look at patching. Patching itself is an operation. You're changing something. When you're changing something, you're introducing operational risk, because when you're patching, you're either adding code or taking away code. So patching actually creates risk, while it's also controlled or reduced risk. And if we just create this hyper fast path of patching everything all the time and hyper speed, you could argue that keeps the hygiene up, but at what burden to the business, at what disruption to computing, at what cost to IT, at what cost to the user for having to reboot? And if you put a better control in place, can you slow the patching window? And if you can take a patch that you would normally do in a week and you could slip it into a quarterly bundle, think of what the operational implications are for IT of playing with that control, and how much money gets freed up to invest in a better control. And so again, think about these things in both the obvious direct cost budgets, but be creative in other ways that you can find money or save resources in not only in IT, but other parts of the business. That will then give you, instead of this I've got a limited budget, now everybody's budget's my budget. Now the question becomes, how do I make them more efficient by putting in better controls? And if I can do that, their budget should be my budget, and I'll go make that business case. And again, the notion of control friction. I mentioned this in the first webinar, but I'll break it out a little bit more. Again, if we slow the user, that's a productivity loss. Now that you could argue is funny money at times, but in mass, it's real, right? Slow a business process, that's a business velocity issue, and that you can tie some real dollars to. And again, as I've mentioned before, if there's too much friction, your business and users go around you, that adds cost. IT isn't managing IT anymore. It adds data and business silos, which again adds cost and complexity to the environment. And again, when that's diffused and that IT spending starts being pushed into other areas, you lose purchasing power. Somebody might have 5 contracts with Salesforce, 5 different infrastructure as a service things out there on credit cards or other things. Why? Because you made it too hard to do business with the security team, or too hard to do business with IT because of the notion of controls that we put in place. And again, it adds risk because the security and risk team becomes blind. They can't prevent it. It's hard to detect what you don't know that's happening. And as I mentioned in the last webinar, again, if the business adheres to a control that slows them down, it generates a systemic business risk, and that will manifest itself in a few ways. They'll lose time to market. What's the cost of that? That would be a great dialogue to go into the board with. We have a control environment that is impeding business velocity, and we're estimating it's causing us to lose time to market. Here's what we want to do to change the control environment. Here's how much we need, and here's the business velocity we're going to give you back. That's a story. That's something that people would listen to and want to have a dialogue around at the executive office level. Again, lose the ability to innovate, long-term market leadership, all those type of things that if you have the controls are an impediment to getting work done. That's the business impact of those things, and one that we need to be accountable for, and one that we need to quantify, and one that we should also use that if we can make better is a budget for us to go grab and get the support of a business leader who wants a better control environment, maybe not to manage risk, but to just make their business operations more effective and efficient. Again, it's framing and focus. You can think of these things, like I said, the misperception of risk, or some of these framing and focus, and some of my notion of choice architect, and it's like taking a camera. There's this aperture of risk. There's this target fixation we get when we focus, and how close and how much we zoom in and how much we back away. We need to think about these dialogues like we've got a camera, and where we're pointing them, and what the aperture is, and what lens we're using to frame these dialogues. It's like in this picture here. I'm focused on this cat, and I've got this particular resolution. Everything else is blurred. That creates, again, the target fixation. That drives the psychology of the perception of risks. This drives the focus or defocus on certain things. And so, again, You might want to frame it this way for one part of the dialogue and then juxtapose it and say, now, the other angle of this, let's focus on the other item that we're not talking about. Again, our job, like I said, to some extent, is to pose these high contrast questions to ensure the right debate and dialogue happens, which means we have to constantly play with a 360-degree view of the dialogues we're having and have the metrics and measurements that give us this three-dimensional view in real time, all the time, of how we're doing. Because that's the only way in which we can manage these risks and manage the cost, but it's also the right way in many cases to have the right business dialogue with our executives. Again, here, you focus on the antelope, and that might be the cool thing that the business leader wants, right? That shiny bauble that they psychologically then get enamored with. And when they do that, they lose sight and discount the risk because they don't see it. And again, our job, without over-focusing on it, is to get them to see both. And that's what I call, if you become this Z-shaped individual, right, with the business acumen, the technical acumen, the risk and security acumen, you can kind of do what I call be tuned to target. When you're making these business cases, you got to understand the market objective of the business. You got to understand the internal and external customer needs, right? You've got to think about, the cost and maintenance of not only the security thing, but the implications on the business. The risk and compliance issues are certainly one leg of this three-legged stool, but again, the productivity and user experience. When making a business case, we go in with all of these and show that we've thoughtfully evaluated them, thoughtfully contemplated the right architecture across all of them, I think we have more success. Some examples here, a disaster recovery business case, and again, simple summaries. Executives, what's the top level view? When I was back at Intel, we did these things, and I did them for my teams as well when we were making investment decisions or making pitches, and I called them a 33-30. What's the 30-second concept? What's the 3-minute elevator pitch? What's the 30-minute deep dive? And so when you think about it, you always have to have your 33-30. What's the 30-second soundbite, 3-minute elevator pitch, 30-minute deep dive? Now, this DR business case example and a couple other ones I'm going to show are a good 30-second soundbite, but you can also spend 3 minutes on it, and depending upon how much depth of backup you have, you could spend 30 minutes on it. Again, this one description, loss of manufacturing capacity equals, $10 million an hour. And you've got some compliance and contract agreements that stipulates you have a DR plan in place that is tested annually. So, you do a simple financial summary. What's the total cost? The capital, the OpEx, total return, net present value, potential impacts on product margins. Again, anything you do in a factory goes straight to cost of goods sold. I don't care if it's even a security deployment. It hits cost of goods sold because it's in the factory. So it has to be recognized there. So you have to think about, again, are you negatively affecting product margins? And sometimes when I hear this from peers, and I saw this at Intel a little bit in the manufacturing environment, you try and make a business case and the factory's like, no. And we're like, well, why? It's a big risk. They understand the risk, but no. And sometimes it's because of the impact on the product margin because you're spending money in the factory. And if you don't understand that, then you can't also have then the right discussion with them. You go, what are the major milestones? Who are the decision makers between the factory, the head of manufacturing, CIO, head of enterprise risk management? Again, what are your assumptions? What are you dependent upon? And again, getting to metrics and measurements, what are the key performance indicators? How is it going to impact manufacturing yield? How is it going to impact compliance or contract adherence? What's our actual incident impact reduction? If we've done a good DR plan and there was some disruption in the factory, yeah, it might have tactically had some impact, but we should be able to show some reduction in the real impact because of the redundancies we put in, the other mitigation we put in that again have allowed factory operations to, by and large, maybe go into a degraded mode but still continue. A one-page business case from replacing traditional AV. A lot of people are doing it. Makes a lot of sense too in many cases. But, you can look at the problem. In this one, hey, we suffered 2,000 security incidents resulting in breach notifications and 3 instances of IP loss. Over 2 years, we had X millions of dollars in response and exposed $10 million in liability. Okay, well, that's a decent problem. Analysis, cost increases are going to continue. We have a deficiency in some things. Solution, we want to replace it, and you explain it. And then you snapshot the project. Here's what it's going to cost. Here's what we're going to do. And again, getting back to objectives, outcomes, key performance indicators. We're going to remove 4 controls. By implementing this new technology, we're going to rescope and reevaluate our security operations and reduce that wasted spend. And we're going to save and reinvest over a couple of year period, a couple $1 million. And then here's kind of those major milestones laid out. This is a great, way to give a 30-second sound bite, a 3-minute overview. Who knows? They might not even ask for a 30-minute deep dive, because if you framed this appropriately and told the right story and put the right measurements and metrics, you're probably going to stand a better chance of, again, improving your business velocity in getting the budget, getting the decisions, getting the movement you need in the right direction. As I've mentioned before, for me, it's all about protecting to enable people, data, and the business. We have to frame it that way. If we're just doing protection for protection's sake, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. It's a cost to the business. And if you can demonstrate, as you're making your business cases, the fact that you are focusing on protection to enable, and how you're doing that for the employees, how you're doing that for customers, how you're doing that for the data the business uses, and ultimately how you're doing that for the business versus just protection for protection's sake, I think you'll be able to make a better business case. Thank you.
Protecting to enable, that's a great message. Thanks, Malcolm. Well, that's about all the time we have for today's webcast. My special thanks to Malcolm Harkins of Cymatic and TrustMap for sharing his insights and expertise with us today. For more information on this topic, please be sure to click on the links in the resources section on your screen. Also, if you'd like to send a question to Malcolm, just type it into the Q&A box in your webcast console and press the submit button. We'll get back to you with an answer within a few days. Finally, please be sure to join us for part 3 of this TrustMap IDG webcast series on managing security as a business function. And be sure to check out part 1 if you haven't already. Until then, for TrustMap and IDG, I'm Tom Schmidt.